So thanks for having me. I will make it to Bristol at some point, I'm sure. But I'll carry on from the sunny Sussex coast and talk to you today about PhpSpec. So my name's Naomi. I am Naomi Go on Twitter. If you want to shout anything at me after this evening, please do, be nice. So yeah, today I am here to talk about, technology. Yeah, test-driven development and how PhpSpec changed the way I think about code. So I didn't always love PhpSpec, but it has grown to become, I think, probably my best loved PHP tool. I started working with it about 4 to 5 years ago now, and yeah, I grew to like it over time. It's something that as soon as it catches the first typo, your opinion starts growing of it, and then over time, as you get more and more familiar with it, you realize, as I'll explain, how it may be shaping the way that you may be architecturing your code. So the standard exclaims about unit testing all apply. Your code will have less bugs. It can be refactored more reliably. And most importantly, you get more sleep at night. So today I'm going to talk about what is PhpSpec, how does it fit into the test-driven development landscape, and how does it differ from other tools such as PhpUnit. Then I'll talk about some aspects of PhpSpec that will force you into making design decisions, which ultimately enhance the quality of your code base. And then finally, we will take a look at some PhpSpec in action. So what is PhpSpec? Well, PhpSpec's website says that PhpSpec is a tool which can help you write clean and working PHP code using Behaviour Driven Development, or BDD. So wait a minute. Behaviour Driven Development? I thought we were talking about test-driven development. What's the difference? Well, in the context of unit testing, not very much actually. I imagine that most of us are familiar with the test-driven development cycle. You start by writing a test which will fail. Then you write some code to make the test pass. And then finally you can refactor, ensuring your test is still passing. In a YouTube presentation on PhpSpec, which I highly recommend, Kieran McNulty, one of the maintainers, describes how this cycle is still very much applies with regard to behavior-driven development at the code level. However, instead of using words such as test, instead, we can say that we first describe the behavior of our code, then we implement that specification, and finally, we improve our implementation. So hopefully you can see that the differences are subtle and ultimately mainly in language. Whilst test-driven development may focus on values and assertions, behavior-driven development focuses on conversations and examples. The PhpSpec website itself acknowledges this by stating that there is no real difference between Spec BDD and TDD. But wait, we were talking about behavior-driven development, and now they've introduced another new term, Spec BDD. What's that? Well, luckily for us, this one is quite easy to break down as well. The PhpSpec documentation goes on to describe 2 levels of behavior-driven development, story and spec. So if you have worked in an agile environment, then the likelihood is you will have come across the story level of behavior-driven development, or story BDD. Here, user stories describe how the application should function. Expectations of application behavior are defined in acceptance criteria scenarios. And integration testing tools such as BHAT can be used to confirm that the application behaves as expected given each scenario. This is behavior-driven development at the story level, or story BDD. However, you may be less aware of the spec level of behavior-driven development. This takes the focus down to the level of the code. Here, specifications describe how the code should function. Expectations of code behavior are defined in examples. Unit testing tools, such as PhpSpec, can be used to confirm that the code functions as expected given each example. This is behavior-driven development at the spec level, or spec BDD. Together, story BDD and spec BDD cover behavior-driven development at the business level and development level, respectively. So we can see where PhpSpec fits into this picture, but what about PhpUnit and what about PhpSpec versus PhpUnit? Well, both can be used to write unit tests, but the main difference is the language that is used in writing the tests. Both of these lines of code are doing the same thing, albeit with a subtle language difference. In the PhpUnit example, we assert that the variable result equals 0. In the PhpSpec example, we say that our result variable should be 0. Hopefully, you can see that in the short example, the PhpSpec example is more human readable than the PhpUnit. And this theme continues throughout PhpSpec's framework. In summary then, we can say that PhpSpec is behavior-driven development at the spec level, or spec BDD, a tool that allows you to test your code at unit level, is structured to follow the standard test-driven development TDD rules of red, green, refactor, is more human readable than other tools, for example, PhpUnit. And finally, and you may not agree with me yet on this one, but believe me, give it time and you will, PhpSpec is actually awesome. So how does PhpSpec force you to think about the quality of your code? Well, in an excellent blog post that was written a few years ago now, actually, but it's still very relevant. And if anyone's interested in getting some more understanding about the internals and behind the scenes of PhpSpec and what makes it work, then this blog post is definitely a good place to start. And in it, Peter Sum highlights that PhpSpec is not a mere testing framework, but is actually a software design and development tool, stating that PhpSpec requires us to think about the structure of our code and enforces certain architectural patterns. And in my experience, I would concur with this. Once working with the test-first philosophy has started to feel more comfortable, and that is definitely a mindset change, and that will take a little while, it's not long after that that you will likely notice how PhpSpec may be affecting the way you are structuring your code. This quote was something a previous boss used to say to me all the time. This was several years ago, before I ever went anywhere near test-driven development. It usually frustrated me greatly whenever he said it, because it would be likely at a time when I was pulling my hair out trying to build some intricate piece of functionality that had inevitably been designed on a postage stamp. But those words always stuck. And it's actually particularly relevant when working with PhpSpec. As maintainer Kieran McNulty says, PhpSpec encourages good design, making it hard to test bad design. If an example or test is difficult or perhaps even impossible to write, then the likelihood is there is something about your code architecture that should be addressed. Being forced to think in this way has definitely helped me feel like my skills in architecturing systems have improved. There are several features of PhpSpec which may at the outset appear very strict, and it is an opinionated tool, but actually help point you towards far better architectural design of your code base. So to help demonstrate this, I'm going to use an example of something that became a very familiar pastime for many of us back in March and April: stock checking. As products such as toilet roll and flour became like gold dust, I was one of the millions who decided that now was the time to get better at baking, soldiering on without the proper ingredients and trying not to be too disappointed with the results. Oh, and before we continue, I just want to point out that the code that you're about to see is for demo purposes only, and you'll probably more than likely see several other ways that it could be improved. But the intention here is to highlight what PhpSpec will and will not allow. In addition, depending on your experience level with unit testing, I may mention some concepts such as mocking and setting expectations, which may be slightly alien to you at this stage. But please bear with me, as when we hit the demos, some of these things may become a bit clearer. Let's take a look at some code. This is an example that PhpSpec will not accept, hence the big red cross in the bottom of the screen. Let's say we're writing a spec for this product class. The isInStock method should return a Boolean to indicate whether or not the product is in stock. In order to check the stock for the product, the isInStock method needs to collaborate with this global procedural function, getStock. However, although PhpSpec will have no problem with calls to PHP's native functions and other raw functions that just say manipulate a string, in this case, the getStock function is instantiating a database object and making a call on its fetch method. In this context, the database object is what is known as a collaborator. When writing a test with PhpSpec for the isInStock function, we would need to create a mock of the database object and set an expectation that its fetch method should be called with the stated SQL query and product ID, and will return the stock of the product currently in the warehouse. However, because PhpSpec is only ever concerned with testing the class that it is specifying, the product class under spec has no knowledge of the database object, meaning we cannot mock it in our test, which leaves us unable to write a test. As such, some forced refactoring becomes necessary. The code that was in the procedural getStock function has been moved into its own warehouse class. This is a positive step architecturally because we've removed the use of procedural code and improved the reliability of our code base, because we can now also write a stock for our spec for our warehouse class. But yet this code still won't satisfy PhpSpec. The instantiation of the warehouse class in the isInStock method will still be a problem when it comes to mocking the call to getStock. And the same will be true when we want to mock the database call when writing the spec for the warehouse class's getStock method. In simple summary, and certainly for our example here, PhpSpec will likely throw a fit if you try to instantiate one class from within another. Essentially, it will actually instantiate the object in question and then try to actually run the subsequent code. And it won't be long before it runs into something it can't do because it doesn't have the relevant context, such as connect to a database. But PhpSpec not liking this is a good thing, because right now our product class is heavily coupled to our warehouse class, and the warehouse class is heavily coupled to the database class. Enter dependency injection, making PhpSpec mocking possible and improving the quality of our code once again by decoupling dependencies. This will be enough to make it possible to write PhpSpec tests. But there's another step that we can take here too. And that is to change these injections to interfaces, removing the dependency on concrete entities. So with PhpSpec's help, we have made our code base more reliable by removing procedural code and by moving procedural code into a class which can also be spec'd, decoupled dependencies by using dependency injection, encouraging the single responsibility principle, introduced interfaces so that our entities depend on abstractions and not concretions, and made fast steps generally towards the solid principles. So hopefully you can see that in just a few steps, we have improved the quality of our code, all to satisfy PhpSpec. And not only will PhpSpec help you architecture your code, but it will also help you keep on the test first track with some cool inbuilt features that automatically create files, methods, and interfaces. This prevents the easy reaction to reverting to writing the code first and then retrospectively writing the tests. In actual fact, it's relatively difficult to write PhpSpec's tests retrospectively, although obviously not impossible. And this is just another one of those little indications that it supports the test first approach. Personally, I've found over time my approach has shifted so much towards the test first philosophy that it's now very strange to work without it. But of course, like all of us, I live in the real world and work at a company of a certain age, meaning that this way of working is not always possible. In my experience of working with legacy code, taking the opportunity to refactor code by writing new spec classes and having the legacy function proxy to that has been a useful way of going about working with PhpSpec and an older code base. But working without spec entirely now feels like walking a high wire between skyscrapers without a safety net. So let's get a demo going. I've prepared some stuff, but there's still some things to do. So what I have done so far is I've created a GitHub repo and I've cloned it. And then I've created a project in my IDE, which is Eclipse. Don't blame me for not using PHP Storm. Again, that work. So we've done those two steps, and now we are going to install PhpSpec and write some code, or rather write some tests and then some code. So this is where I'm going to switch over from my slides to my editor. Can you see my editor?
No, we're still getting slides at the moment.
Okay.
Now we've got an editor.
Cool. Excellent. So on the left here, you've got the project, which basically shows that it's empty at the moment. Hopefully sharing my entire screen or everything that's on there. So what I'm going to do, you should now be seeing the PhpSpec website.
Yes.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the quick start guide from the website, which tells me I need to create a composer.json file with this content in it. So let's do that. Okay, save that. To my command line and run composer install. This should just load the dependencies from the cache, so we won't be sat here for a lengthy amount of time. But as it's doing that, we'll see what it will create in a second, which will be essentially a skeleton project for where the spec and source files will be stored. There is, it's worth saying, decent documentation on the configuration of PhpSpec itself on the website. Obviously, I'm just using the most simple quick start to demo it to you this evening. So we'll be done with installing it in just a moment. There will be one additional change that I will make because I far prefer the output with a specific formatter than the default one. Okay, we are done with that. So if we come back here, we will now see what the install has done. So we've now got our vendor directory, and we've also got our bin directory, which is where there's a PhpSpec batch file that we will be using to run PhpSpec. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a PhpSpec YAML file. I think. And I'm just going to put a formatter name pretty in there because when you have that set, when it runs the tests, it lists each one out one by one rather than just a percentage bar going up the screen. It's just I find it just a nicer way of looking at the output of tests. There's something satisfying about seeing a lot of green going up the screen, obviously no red. So we have installed PhpSpec, and I've just added the YAML file for bit of configuration. So as per the quick start guide, we have completed step 1, we've completed step 2, and now we can start writing specs. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a spec for the product class that was in the demo just now. Sorry, in the code example just now. So to create a spec file, so we create a spec file that specifies what we actually want our class in question to do. We start by running bin PhpSpec and then the command describe. So you can either write the full word describe, or you can use the shorthand of desc. And then you can specify, let's say, namespace, Naomi Go, and let's go for describing a product class. So it gives us a little bit of output. It tells us that it's created the specification for Naomi Go product in a spec directory that it has created back here. So we have a spec directory. We also have a source directory, which is ultimately where our class, our actual class that we're writing the spec for, will reside. There's nothing in there yet, but we have this product spec class. And it's very, very minimal at the moment. It's got one predetermined test in it, which is it is initializable. And the first thing that everyone always questions when they see PhpSpec for the first time is the use of this. In the spec files, this, as you will see, actually also not only does it refer to this class that we're in, but it also refers to the class that we are specifying, the class under spec, which is really cool actually, because it just keeps the language really nice, really kind of flowing. So I won't say too much more about that for now this evening, but yeah, that you can use this in the spec file to mean both this in the context of the spec file and this in the context of the class that you are writing a spec for. So we have a spec file, we've described it. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to run that spec file. So if I'm just going to modify the describe command to run. And we have a broken test. Our is initializable function test or example is broken, and it's telling us that class Naomi Go product does not exist. But down here it's doing something really cool. So it's asking me, do you want me to create Naomi Go product for you? Yes or no? Why, thank you. Yes, please. And now we get that output that says Naomi Go product, class Naomi Go product has been created in our source directory namespace product.php, and it's done that, and then it's rerun the test, and what was previously broken is now green, passing. We have one passing test. And if we go back into our product, our directory structure here, project directory, and refresh that, we now have our product class. Not doing anything yet, but it's cool. We haven't actually written any code yet. So we've got our spec class and we've got our product class. And now we're going to write our first test, first example. So we want to write a function called isInStock, and that's going to tell us whether or not the product in question is in stock. So every PhpSpec test begins with the word it. You can do it should, it is, it will. I tend to do it should, but I think that's more out of habit than anything else. So let's just say it should, it should be in stock. Let's keep it simple for now. So we're going to have a function in our class called isInStock. So when I call this is in stock, so again, this is going to be, this is in the context of our product class. This is in stock, should return true. So what we've said here is we're going to have a function called isInStock in our class, and it should return the Boolean true. Should return is what's known as a matcher in PhpSpec, and there are many matchers, things like should equal, should, well, there are many. They're all documented. Please feel free to go and peruse the documentation. But yeah, we're using should return the Boolean true. So let's run that. So our first test is still passing, but our second test is broken because the method Naomi Go product is in stock is not found. So it's asking, do you want me to create it for you? Yes, please. Excellent. So now it's created the method for us, but now we have a failing test. So there's a difference between a broken test and a failing test. So a broken test is something that cannot be run, but a failing test is where there's a logical error. So in this particular case, the logic error is that we expect it to return true, but it's actually getting null. And if we have a look at the product class, you can see that PhpSpec has created our function is in stock and told us that we need to write some logic here. But there's this cool option that you can add to the end of your call to when you run the test. It's called fake. I only discovered this very recently. So if I add fake to the end of my call to run the test, this time my test has failed again, but it's asking me, do you want me to make Naomi Go product is in stock always return true for you? Yes. And now we have two passing tests. And if we go back to the code, PhpSpec has made our is in stock function return true. Excellent. Still written no code in the actual class. So there are a number of ways we could diverge this at this point, but I think let's go with the writing a second test. Yeah, it should not be in stock. Actually, we'll come back if the warehouse has no stock. Yeah. Hopefully you can see that although this looks like a really weird way of writing a function name, it's actually documenting the code as you go along. And when it prints it out on the screen when you run the test, it actually looks very readable. So that's quite a nice side effect of the way that the test functions are structured. So let's say it should be in stock if the warehouse has stock. So we'll come back to this one in a minute, but let's expand on our first test here. So the first thing is we're going to need to have the product. We're going to need to make a call to a warehouse class, and we'll get to that. But before we get to that, we need to have constructed our class with a product ID. So I'm going to set a variable here that's going to be our product ID. So our product ID or ID is 123, and then I'm going to use the next nice function of PhpSpec, which is this be constructed with ID. So I'm saying that my product class should be constructed with the ID 123. So let's run that. I'm going to take the fake off now. Construct's not been found. My test is broken because it's tried to construct the class with an ID and it hasn't been able to, but it's asking me if I want to create the construct. Yes. Too few arguments passed. Is it 0 passed and exactly 1 expected? And I suspect that this is because this one is now failing. Is that what's failing? Yes, it is initializable as failing because it itself, we can make it pass by adding this line to be constructed with. So at the start of each test, you have to construct the class that you're testing with. If we have a quick look at what it's done here, it's created the construct method. I'm just going to change that to that. Let's run this again. Undefined variable. Thanks. That wasn't in the script. Should pass. Cool. So we have 2 passing tests and 1 pending test because we haven't written it yet. But now you can see we've got some code duplication going on here. And PhpSpec has a special function for this, and which is let. PhpSpec will run the let function before each of the tests in question. So if I take that code and put it here, then I can take it out of there. It also reads kind of nicely. It says like, let this be constructed with ID, which is, again, language is subtle, but it's really cool how it does that. So let this be constructed with ID, and now we should still have passing tests, because essentially all we've done is refactor our spec, which we do. Okay, so we know that we've constructed our class with ID, but now we want to, in our isInStock method, we want to use our ID and we want to pass it to our warehouse class, but we haven't created that yet. So what I'm going to say is we're going to use an interface. We're going to have, let's say, a warehouse interface. This doesn't exist yet. That's to tell me you haven't used it anywhere. But we're going to use it here. We'll call it warehouse mock. So we're going to say, we're now going to define an expectation that a collaborator is going to be used. And I've also just realized that, okay, one step at a time. So warehouse mock get stock 123, which is the ID of the product that we've constructed the class with, should be called, that's our expectation, should be called, and that will return. So we're setting we're specifying what it's going to return. Let's say it's going to return 10, at which point isInStock should return true. So let's run the code. Interesting. Let's save the file. Let's run the test. Cool. So we've said we're using a warehouse interface, and PhpSpec is now asking me if it wants if I want it to generate the warehouse interface for me, and I'm going to say yes. And then it runs it again, and the second time through it says, would you like me to generate a method signature warehouse interface get stock for you? And I'm going to say yes. So now we have a failing test. So behind the scenes, oh, not that directory, this one. Behind the scenes, we now have a warehouse interface, and it has created that function in the interface. It's also nice because you can write the warehouse class on another day. So no calls have been made that match warehouse interface get stock, but expected at least one. So what I realized just now is that we also need to pass the warehouse interface into the construct method function, so it's then ready to be used in our isInStock method. So we're going to need to make our warehouse interface available to our let method and pass warehouse mock into our be constructed with. This shouldn't make, this won't make any more tests fail than are already failing. The initializable is still functioning, I think, because we're just essentially adding another parameter to our warehouse interface. Warehouse. Now I'm just going to do a little bit more code here because we're going to need this. Okay, so now our test will still be in the same state, but now we can make that test, that red test, pass. So we're going to do stock equals this warehouse get stock with this ID, and let's say if stock is greater than 0, return true. We're going to get rid of that for now. This is, in theory, you really should do the minimum that you need to do to make the test pass, but hopefully this should now make our test pass, which it does. So we can now populate our second function, which it should not be in stock if the warehouse has no stock. So we're going to bring our, make use of our warehouse mock down here. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to copy paste this. So this time we'll call get stock for our product, but instead of returning 10, we're going to set the expectation that it will return 0. And therefore our is in stock method should return false. Let's just go. So it expected false, but got null. And that's because we haven't returned false from there. Now we should get a passing test. So hopefully that's given a brief demonstration. There's a couple of other things to show you. PhpSpec's got this nice thing called an object state matcher, which allows you to, for functions that begin is, so basically any kind of Boolean is active, for example, is in stock. Instead of this is in stock should return true, you can actually just do this should be in stock. Get rid of that. And for the same down here, this should not be in stock. So all the matchers have a negative matcher with the word not against the matcher. So should be in stock. What this does behind the scenes is it looks for a method is in stock, which obviously we have. So these should still pass. Another thing you can do is in test files, you can set actual expectation functions. Set stock expectations stock. We'll need the warehouse. So refactoring applies not only to your, doesn't necessarily only apply to your class and the spec, but can also apply to your test file, spec file itself. This is like probably over engineering what we need right now. But when you get a file with many tests in it, this does sometimes become useful. So instead of 10 there, we would have stock. Then instead of this line here, we would have this. And in this particular case, this is referring to the private function that is actually present in this class. So we would say it's 10. And this one would be 0. And then we still have passing tests. Yeah, and I think in my own demo, in my own example code, I was doing something like return in a single line stock greater than 0 true. Refactored, still got green passing tests. Can get sleep tonight. And I think that's about it from me, really. Yeah. So thanks for listening, and open to any questions you may have.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks very much for that talk. Really interesting. It looks like we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. First one, does it have to be with underscores to be described?
With the function names, I
Oh,
believe,
yeah, the function name, yeah.
I believe so. Yes. Sorry, I possibly shouldn't have stopped sharing my screen there. So we're talking about these functions here. I believe they have to be underscores. I've never seen them anything other than underscores. So yes, I believe so.
Cool. Actually, yep, and that was the, yep, those are the questions. So if anyone else has any more questions, pop them in the Q&A
There's a
channel.
couple in chat as well.
Oh, there's a couple in chat as well. I've actually got a question. How does it know, so this code, this product spec, how does it know that it's referring to the product class?
This one.
Yeah.
So there's some magic method behind the scenes, and there's some use of reflection. I think it's to do with I want to say this, but I don't think it is, because you can get rid of that test and everything still works. I think because it's the name of the file. So you've got product spec and you have product the class. So it knows that because you've got product spec, the file under test is product, and in this object behavior class that all the specs extend, it does some magic where it goes, right, I know that we're writing the spec for the product class, so it can create and follow instances and check via I think it's reflection, isn't it, whether the methods are there or not.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much. We've got another question. Can you use PhpSpec with the Laravel project?
Oh, I was looking forward to this one. So we've used Laravel a little bit at work last year, and I had fun with their facades. They use a lot of static calls, and PhpSpec doesn't particularly like, or it doesn't deal with static functions very well, or often end up having to proxy around them, so creating essentially a wrapper class with a wrapper function that you can mock a call to. But with Laravel, you can write spec with Laravel, because we managed to, but you kind of have to work around the facades, like potentially sort of change your approach to how you may sort of out of the box use the facades, and you actually use the classes that they're wrapped around more than the facade. So it's possible, but from my experience, it's not the most immediately easiest thing. It depends how you're working with Laravel in the code in yourself. I'm not sure I've explained myself particularly well there, but it's not straightforward. I think someone had a go at writing a library that assisted working with Laravel and Spec, attempted to use that, but it was didn't have huge amounts of time with it. So yes, I had some success, but no, I didn't have complete success with it. So
yeah,
yes and no.
No, thank you for that. I expect if I was going to say something controversial, I'd go back to, what was it, one of your slides? If it's difficult, then you're doing it wrong, or
If
something
it's
like
complicated,
that.
then you're doing it wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'll leave
Yeah.
people to make the connections there between that and facades. But anyway, has anyone else got any more questions before I get assassinated on Twitter for making such comments about Laravel?
There was something about, I don't know about Symfony, I'm afraid. The prompt is Commander for the person that commented about that.
One other question. If you had, what happens if you actually had a name on a product, on product, if you had a method called should have type or something like that, should be in
It doesn't
stock?
like that. I think I discovered that not that long ago, actually. It's funny because in the years of working with it, I'd never wanted to have a function in a class that began with the word should, but it's not a good idea. There's some stuff going on behind the scenes that where it intercepts the method that you're calling on. It would intercept a method beginning with the word should, I believe. I'm not 100% certain, but I think it would intercept the method that begins with should and think that you are setting an expectation or a matcher or something along those lines and not be successful.
I see. So all of the, were they matches? They all start with should.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a, what's it? A
Convention.
keyword.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Has anyone else got any more? Someone else is just. Oh, I see. Yeah, Kieran Reynolds pop something in. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, if you had. Oh, I see. So if you is that saying if you had? Oh, that's how you would call. So if one person,
yeah,
is that what you're saying? Yeah, yeah. Okay, I get it.
That's right. I see. Yeah, I see what's going on there. Yeah, it skips the matcher magic.
Brilliant.
There you go. So yes.
Well, thank you very much for that talk. It's really interesting, and yeah, no, I've not really even. Well, I mean, I've heard of PhpSpec, but it's really interesting to see how quickly you can write things and just how easy you can make your mocks and stubs and things like that. So it's really, yes, it was really, really powerful. Really.
Yeah, as I say, it's my most loved PHP tool by far. So I'll advocate for it all day. But yeah, no. Hopefully, I've managed to put it across to you guys to maybe experiment with it.
Yeah, I'm sure I won't be the only one who'll have to play with it over the coming weeks.